Good morning, and welcome to day 132 of F260 at First Baptist Meridian. Today we look at Ezra chapters 7 and 8. And since we haven't been in Ezra for a few days, just some reminder on what we're looking at and what Ezra is all about. Ezra is one half of a two-book history of what goes on with God's people after the exile. By way of reminder, God took his people out of Egypt and brought them into a land he had promised to their forefathers, and there set up a kingdom. But that kingdom ultimately split, and because both the northern part of that kingdom and the southern part of that kingdom failed to keep the covenant, God allowed the northern part to be overrun by the Assyrians in 722 BC, and the southern part to be overrun by the Babylonians in 587 BC. The Babylonians deported a good number of especially the wealthy and educated Judeans to Babylon to raise them in the court there, some of what we're finding in the book of Daniel. But eventually the Babylonians were also conquered by the Persians, and Cyrus of Persia had a policy of letting exiles return home. And so that's where we find ourselves in Ezra and later Nehemiah. The exiles have come home to a city in ruins. And so project number one was what? Rebuilding the temple. This is where we looked at the prophets Zechariah and Haggai, who talked about not only a spatial return to the land, but a spiritual return to God. And this was marked by the rebuilding of the temple. And we saw some of the obstacles that they had in that project, both financially and from foes, enemies outside, who got the construction progress halted for more than a decade until the temple was finally completed in 516 BC. Well, with Ezra chapter 7, we are zooming forward more than a generation. We're going from the completion of the temple and, importantly, the celebration of Passover to the next wave of exiles that returns home under Ezra all the way in 458 BC. So we're going from about 516 at the end of 6 to 458 in chapters 7 and 8. And one of the things you notice is that Ezra does not have as many exiles coming home with him as Zerubbabel and Yeshua had. But it's interesting, you see halfway through chapter 8 that Ezra puts the brakes on this return until because he realizes they don't have any Levites. Why is having a Levite so important? This is something that puzzled me for a while, and actually I got an idea about this from a New Testament professor, a professor of mine, Dr. Gerald Stevens, who looked at the book of Acts. It's long been noted that the Gospels have such an intimate focus on the relationship between Jesus and Passover. Passover, by the way, celebrating what? The exodus of God's people. This is anticipated by the prophets. We looked at this in Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel in particular, how they pictured a new exodus, so to speak. But Dr. Stevens noticed this in the book of Acts. Following up on Passover, an Exodus event, what's the next celebration in the year? It's Pentecost, and Pentecost involves the presence of a Levite. For Dr. Stevens, this is why in the book of Acts there's such a particular focus on the character of Barnabas, who plays a pivotal role in spreading the Christian mission beyond Jerusalem and moving from, and again, what's the initial celebration? When does God send the Spirit on the church in Acts? At Pentecost. Pentecost involves a Levite. Who is Barnabas? He is a Levite. And it's Barnabas who will put the foot in the door for Paul. So I rewind from that back to Ezra, and I wonder, they celebrated Passover at the end of chapter 6, right when the temple had been rebuilt. The temple that God said would be even more glorious, if not in construction, than on some other front than the temple that came before it, the Temple of Solomon. By the way, this Zerubbabel's temple is ultimately the one visited by God in the flesh, Jesus Christ. So they celebrate that Passover, and I cannot help but wonder, are they anticipating this as a staging point for something even bigger than God is going to do? Are they expecting a Pentecost emphasis? Because what does Jeremiah say? After the exile, there's going to be a new covenant. I will put my law on their mind and write it on their heart. What is Ezra coming to do? He's coming to lead the people in the study of the law. He's positioning himself with expectation that God is going to use even the small thing that's been done so far to do something even bigger. I think Ezra wants those Levites present because he's hoping for some kind of Pentecost emphasis, one that ultimately comes, I think, in the New Testament with Jesus and the sending on the Spirit. But it's interesting to see the foundation laid for that even in the closing days of the Old Testament story. So, food for thought. Keep reading, reflecting, and responding, and I'll see you tomorrow. God bless.